Okay, stand there and watch it. Make sure that red light stays on. And yeah, and by the way, if since it's recording now, is it still going? Red light still going? Okay, Torrens, give me the thumbs up. Yeah, so presuming that this one works, I had trouble with the card or the camera or something, some technical failure last week, and it might have been something I did, transferring it from the card to the computer. So who knows? There's a lot of steps in between that can mess things up. But
I think you checked it every day.
well, I appreciate that, but I bought a brand new SD card, a big, huge one with 128 gigabytes. That ought to cover it. Hopefully I don't go that long. Anyway, so hopefully this one will work. So this is, as you see by the background there with the palm branches, in the church calendar, in the traditional church world, this is called Palm Sunday. The Sunday before Easter is called Palm Sunday. And the way it goes is like this. Palm Sunday, then Easter, then the snake hunt. And if you're from around, if you're local around here, you know that in the little town to the south of Winoka, they have this snake hunt. They always have it the week after Easter. So that's how the church calendar goes. Palm Sunday, Easter, then snake hunt. And so we probably won't have anything background to make for the snake hunt, but we do have this picture of a palm branch. And the reason it's called Palm Sunday is in recognition of the fact that in the week preceding what we celebrate at Easter, of course, is the death and resurrection of Jesus, which, as Mary Ann was pointing out, coincides with the Jewish Passover feast. And that's no accident, really, because in the Passover, the Jewish Passover is a recognition of an event that took place in the history of Israel in which they were in bondage in Egypt, and to release them from their bondage, God sent plagues on the captors or the oppressors of the Israelites, and the final plague was the angel of death came into the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of every family would die. And again, there's tremendous symbolism, because of Christ. You can see that easily. But what the message to the Israelites was through Moses was, take a lamb and sacrifice or kill the lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of your house. And when the angel of death, the angel of judgment, representing God's judgment, when the angel of death comes, when he sees the blood of the lamb, he will pass over. And that's why they call it Passover. Now, it's not that the people inside the house who believed and trusted in the blood of the lamb, that's really what they were doing. They believed the message and they trusted in the blood of the lamb. And it's not that they got off the hook, but it's that when the angel of judgment or the angel of death came to execute judgment, when he saw the blood, he said to himself, there's been a death here already. And that's really what the message is. Now, it doesn't say that in the text. I'm just telling you that's how it could be understood. And so it is with the fulfillment of that symbol, which is Jesus and his death on the cross. And a person might ask themselves, why was it necessary for Jesus to die? Well, the reason it was necessary, he could have just come as a teacher, and said some wise things. And a lot of Christians, a lot of other people regard him that way. Mahatma Gandhi, the person who helped India achieve their independence, they regard him sort of like we think of George Washington. He's the father of Indian independence from Great Britain, which colonized India. And sort of like Egypt were the oppressors of India. Mahatma Gandhi led in a revolution, a revolt against the oppressors of India. That was the British. And he was an admirer of Jesus. He admired Jesus as a teacher, though he was never a Christian. He was always a Hindu his entire life, yet he regarded Jesus as a teacher. And some Christians say, well, yes, I try to follow the teachings of Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. The teachings of Jesus are good. Of course, he taught good things. But the real significance of Jesus is he came to be the sacrifice to take away our sins. I think most people instinctively understand that, if you think about God at all, if you have any concept of God whatsoever, you instinctively understand that there's God up there somewhere who is perfect and righteous and holy. And on the other hand, then there's us down here who are not that, who fall short of that. And so that dissonance between the fact that God is perfect, righteous, and holy, and the fact that we are flawed in some ways, and the Bible term for that is sin or mistake, or really sin literally means missing the mark or falling short of the mark. And I've never really met anyone yet who comes to me and says, I'm perfect, by the way. I've never done anything wrong. Everyone says, well, I may not be perfect, but at least I'm better than that person over there. But hey, it doesn't work that way. God doesn't grade on a curve. Unless you're perfect also, then you have a problem where God is concerned, because there's an outstanding, there's something that has to be paid for, you might say. The Bible presents the idea of sin or falling short or transgression, however you want to think of it, as a debt. And Paul even says it this way: the wages of sin is death. But the good news about that is Jesus has come, and like the Passover lamb, there's been a death already, and that's what we want to talk about. The death of Jesus was not just some unfortunate thing that happened, or some mistake, or some crime, or some terrible tragedy. It was on purpose. It was a deliberate fulfillment of what God had in multitudes of symbols throughout what we regard as the Old Testament. Jews regard it simply as their scripture, like the Passover lamb, for instance. Jesus came to fulfill that. So, the palm branches, I was going to mention that. In the church world, we call this Palm Sunday, and that's because in the week before his crucifixion, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a little donkey, and people cheered him, and they threw palm branches down, and they said, Hosanna, and they celebrated his entrance into Jerusalem, because they thought, mistakenly, that the plan of God was to establish a physical, earthly, political kingdom. And they thought Jesus was going to be some kind of a revolutionary ruler or leader, and lead a revolt against Rome and throw out those pagan Romans, and establish a physical kingdom in Jerusalem. And that was not, and will never be, and has never been God's plan, to establish a physical earthly kingdom. His plan has always been from the very beginning to rule in the place where it really matters, in the hearts of human beings. And so, although they cheered him when he rode into Jerusalem, 1 week later, they were standing outside Pilate's courtyard chanting, "Crucify him, crucify him," which is kind of ironic that all that could change in 1 week's time. So what we want to do in recognition of the fact that in what we call the Easter season, it's the essence and really the core of Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So we want to talk about this week the death of Jesus, and what was it for, and what did it accomplish? Did it accomplish anything? Did it have any meaning? Did it have any purpose? And then next week we want to do the same thing with the resurrection. Did it accomplish anything? Is there any reason for it? Why? So we want to look at that. So I want to begin today by reading from John's Gospel. All of the Gospel writers describe the crucifixion of Jesus, but they all talk about different things. They all talk about it in different ways, and to me that just speaks of the fact that we're dealing with human beings. If you read the four Gospels and they all read word for word exactly the same, what you would think is this is some kind of a scam here. It's like if people came into court, four different people that witnessed an event, and they all testified word for word the same, you'd think, well, they got together and rehearsed their story. But the fact that the Gospel writers all describe slightly different things from different points of view speaks to the authenticity of what it is that they're all describing. So they all tell something slightly different, but I'm going to read from John's Gospel, chapter 19, Torrin, and we're just going to cut to the chase, just cut to the last event in the crucifixion of Jesus, and that is his death. Verse 30, John chapter 19, verse 30. Of course, there's a lot leading up to this, but we're just going to get to the heart of the matter. So what we want to answer is, what's it all for? What's the purpose? What's the meaning? And here we find in verse, 30, it said, when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. That's just King James polite language for saying he died. He gave up his spirit, or the ghost. Now, when it says he received the vinegar, don't imagine it like cooking vinegar like you might find at Walmart. It doesn't mean that kind of vinegar. This is the King James translation. This was all written in the Greek language to begin with, so the translators have to take these words and somehow bring them into the English language. And what really, if you look at the word that's translated vinegar here, and you look at the Greek word behind it, what it's really talking about is wine, but it is sour or expired, what we would call expired. You know, when you go to the store and they have something on sale and they say, well, it's past its date, it's expired. With wine, you know, if it's gone bad, in other words, and it's sour, that's really literally what it means, sour wine or bad wine that's gone bad. And so they would sell it at a discount. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. That's what they do with things that have expired. And so soldiers and people like that, you know, who are, you know, they would buy the cheapest stuff, you know. And so that's what we're talking about, the cheap or the sour or the rotten, bad, expired wine that the soldiers had on hand there. They had taken some of that and soaked a sponge in it and then presented it up to the lips of Jesus. And, you know, you might think, oh, well, Jesus, you know, he's not going to drink that wine, but he did. He took it and received it into himself. He drank it. And it says here, when he had therefore received it says vinegar, but it means the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Now, I think nothing in this story of the crucifixion and death of Jesus is by accident. Just like we were describing before, the fact that it coincides with the Jewish Passover is not by accident. The fact that Jesus received this sour or wine that has gone bad is not by accident. If you read in the New Testament, wine is sometimes presented as a symbol of the Spirit. And if you talk about a wine that's gone bad, what does that symbolize? Well, a spiritual condition that's gone sour or gone bad. Now, when we say that Jesus died for our sins, or paid, you know, if the wages of sin is death, and he's the death for it, this signifies that he is taking into himself the rotten or sour or failed or, you know, everything, the flawed spirit of mankind. That's the best way to understand that. He is there to do that. You know, Paul in his writings, in his epistles, he's even a little more blunt about it. And again, Paul is so blunt that some Bible commentators that I've heard with my own ears say, well, no, Paul's wrong. Well, you can't say, no, Paul's wrong, by the way. You know, you might have a different opinion. You know, if your church doctrine doesn't agree with the Apostle Paul, I'd say you need to change your church doctrine. But the Apostle Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, said that on the cross, Jesus became sin for us. And now that's pretty strong. Writing to the Galatians, it said that Jesus was cursed by God for us. That's also very strong language. And I've heard Bible commentators say, no, it can't be, that can't be right. But it is right. He drew into himself that which deserved God's judgment. Just like the Passover lamb was the death that satisfied the angel of death that came for judgment. Jesus drew into himself the sinful or the fallen, or you could say it this way, everything that represents in you a flaw or a fault. Not just you, but all of, you know, we all share that in common, by the way. There are some things that unite us all. I mean, we have our individual distinctive differences, but there are some things that are common to all human beings. And that is, one thing is, we are all flawed, and we all have faults, and we all have things that would otherwise disqualify us from having favor from God. That's what Jesus took. That's what the vinegar, the sour wine, symbolizes. He took it in. He made it a part of himself. But that's really not what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is what he said when he did that. The last thing he said, it is finished. Well, I looked that up in some other translations. Here's what the Common English Bible says. It is completed. Here's what the Complete Jewish Bible says. It is accomplished. Here's what the contemporary English version says. Everything is done. So evidently, something got finished. Something got completed. Something got accomplished. Something got done. So my question is, well, what was finished? What was accomplished? What else did it? Completed? What got done in this death on the cross? Well, we could sit here and, exchange opinions about it. Well, I think this, I think that. We don't have to do that. We're told explicitly what got done. Jesus is the first one, by the way, who hinted at it. For this, I'm going to turn to Matthew's Gospel, Torrin, Matthew chapter 26, starting with verse 27. Matthew 26, 27. Now, Matthew is here telling us about an event that took place just before the crucifixion, where Jesus met with his disciples one last time. We call it the Last Supper. That's the phrase or the euphemism we use for it, the Last Supper. He met with his disciples, and during that meal, he did something very remarkable. Let me see if I can find that. Matthew, what did I say? Oh, it'd help if I turn to the right page. Matthew 26, 27. Well, let's back up to 26, Torrin. How about that? Matthew 26, 26. That'll be easier to remember anyway. And let's get verse 26. So they're sitting down having this meal, and just in a few hours he's going to be taken away and taken to the cross and crucified. As they're sitting there eating, it says, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and he blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." And I'm sure they scratched their head and said, "What now?" But he's not done yet. Verse 27 says, "He took the cup and he gave thanks and he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink ye all of it.'" By the way, you know what the cup had in it? It had wine in it. Now, it didn't have sour wine. It had good wine. Again, signifying something real. But Jesus took the cup and he blessed it and he gave it to them and said, "Now you drink it." And then he said something very remarkable in verse 28. Speaking symbolically of what it represents, why he's doing this. He said, "This is my blood of the New Testament," or you could say new covenant, a new arrangement, a new agreement, a new reality, a new understanding between heaven and earth, you could say. This is my blood of the new covenant, the New Testament. And listen, then he tells you what the meaning is. Now, of course, blood, it wasn't really blood. It didn't become blood. It was always wine, but it symbolized his death. That's where his blood would be shed. He said, "My body broken for you. This is my blood of the new covenant." Well, what was the purpose? We're asking ourselves what got finished in that death on the cross. He tells you right here, "This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many." Now, that word "many" doesn't mean, the majority, but excluding some. It just means for everybody. It's a universal word. For many, and what's it for? For the remission of sins. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? We don't go around using the word remission in our everyday talk, but if you've had any contact with the medical field, or if you've ever known anybody that's had cancer, that's a word that's used in the treatment of cancer. And that word would come up if you're talking about cancer. It's sometimes used in that context. And so after treatment, a doctor might say, "Well, the cancer is in remission." Well, what does the doctor mean when he says the cancer is in remission? That means it doesn't show up anymore, or it's gone away. It's not a factor anymore. Isn't that what it means when it's used in that context? In the terms of cancer. Now, the doctors will never let you off the hook completely. They don't want to finally say, well, they don't want to be liable for saying, they're trying to cover their bases. I don't fault the doctors for that. But what it really means in the medical sense is it's gone away. It's not a factor. It's gone. It's no longer relevant. It's in remission. It's disappeared, in other words. It's dead. It's, you don't have to worry about it. So that's what it means. And so Jesus is saying that about sin because of the shedding of his blood, because of what his death on the cross would accomplish. This is my blood of the New Testament, shed for many for the remission of sin. So it's going to go away, in other words, so to take it away. Now, I'm just using that in the term, in kind of a casual way, the way we would understand it if we were talking to somebody in terms of cancer. If you look it up in the dictionary, there are a variety of different definitions, but this is the one that's most relevant. The word remission can mean, in terms of a legal sense, the discharge from penalties. The discharge from penalties. In other words, a release, you might say. A discharge or a release from penalties. I looked it up and online. It means the cancellation of a debt, charge, or penalty. Discharge from penalties. Now, Jesus says that the shedding of blood that he's going to offer is going to have this result. It's going to discharge who? Well, those for whom he died. The many or the all, the group, everyone, mankind. Discharge from penalties. Let me read all those things again. Cancellation of the debt. Now, before we comment on that any further, let's skip over to something the Apostle Paul wrote, but we're going to keep that in mind. This is in Colossians chapter 1, and we're going to begin reading with... there's so many good things we could read here, but I'm going to cut right to the chase like we've done earlier, verse 20. We're trying to answer the question, what got finished? What got accomplished? What got done? Well, Jesus said what's going to get done. He spoke before the fact, and he said, here's what's going to get done. Sin is going to be canceled. Everyone's going to be discharged from the penalties. It's remarkable that the Apostle Paul was not there. He was not present. He wasn't an apostle then. He was not one of the 12 disciples. In fact, he wasn't even called Paul at that time. He was Saul, and he was a Pharisee, and he was a persecutor of the Christians after Jesus' resurrection. And he was so angry about the Christian, he considered them a cult, a Jewish cult, and he was arresting them with authority from the chief priest and throwing them into prison. But Jesus interrupted that course of Saul's life and appeared to him on a road to a town called Damascus in modern-day Syria, and he changed his thinking. He changed his, he had an experience that changed his understanding of things. And he tells us in his writings that the message that I'm preaching, he said, I didn't get it from men. I didn't get it from Peter, James, and John. I got it directly from Jesus himself. Now, the reason this is significant is we just read what Jesus said before going to the cross, just before, and he said, I'm going to the cross, and it's going to be like this. My body's going to be broken. I'm going to shed my blood, but here's what it means. It's going to be for the discharge from penalties, from sin. And you know what he did, and this is also significant. He said, I'm going to go do all those things. But then he gave the bread and the wine to the disciples, and he said, here, you take it and eat it. Take it and drink it. In other words, he's asking them to receive it or accept it for themselves. Now we're going to read what the Apostle Paul said. Now see, he writes after it was all accomplished, after it's all done. And he got information directly from Jesus about what it means. And so we're asking the question, what got accomplished? What got done? Well, as a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul, if you read his letters, if you read his writings, this is the focal point of really all of what he had to say. What got done, what got accomplished, what was finished by Jesus in his death on the cross. Verse 20. This is Colossians chapter 1, verse 20. Paul writes, listen to this now. And having made peace through the blood of his cross, again, we just read about Jesus on the cross, didn't we? Saying, it is finished. And shedding his blood, we read what he said about it. Now Paul's writing about the same thing. Having made peace through the blood of his cross, let's just stop there for a moment. What kind of peace? Well, not peace between nations. We've never seen that. There's been somewhere in the world, there's been some kind of warfare, I think, going on from as long as there's been records kept, and even to this very day. So it wasn't meaning peace between nations. And he didn't also mean peace between individuals. There's been conflict and friction between individuals ever since the beginning of time, starting with Cain and Abel. the first offspring of Adam and Eve to this very day. That's not what he means. As we're going to see here in a moment, he's going to be explicit about it. He means peace between heaven and earth, or peace between God and man. Now, Jesus said, I'm going to shed my blood, and the effect is going to be the discharge from penalties. So God, who is up here, the righteous, perfect, holy judge, and we down here who are the ones who are in jeopardy or have a debt or have a penalty due because of our flaws and faults. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether you've only got a few or whether you've got a lot. Jesus made that explicit. It doesn't matter whether there's somebody worse than you or somebody better than you. If you miss the mark at all, then you've missed the mark. And so everybody's got a debt. But what God does is he looks down from heaven and says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send Jesus, and instead of you having to pay the debt, instead of you having to be judged, instead of you getting the penalty that you deserve, I'm going to send Jesus. And he's going to step in, and at the right moment, he's just going to, like a sponge, absorb it all, like that sponge that they filled with the sour wine. And he's just going to pay the debt for everybody. So what God's saying is, I'm going to discharge you from the penalty. You're going to be set free from the penalty. You go free. Just like in the Passover that we described, the lamb, the blood of the lamb, was the death. And those inside the house who trusted in the blood of the lamb, there's been a death already. So here, when Paul says, having made peace by the blood of his cross, he means peace between God and you. Or not just you, but all of humanity. You know, people who say wrongly that God is up in heaven looking down at the world and he's mad and he's getting angry and he's upset, they must not have read the same thing I've read. And I wonder sometimes. It does. It puzzles me. The things I hear sometimes coming out of preachers' mouths, it does cause me some consternation, I'll be honest with you. What I read here is that God has made peace by the blood of his cross. What you could ask yourself is, well, for whom was that blood shed? Well, Jesus said for many. If we want to get some more insight into that, the Apostle John, when he's writing in his first epistle, writes this, that Jesus is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but for the sins of the whole world. Well, when you say the sins of the whole world, that's pretty explicit, isn't it? Doesn't that just sort of draw a big circle around all of humanity? Yeah, and a propitiation, by the way, that's another word we don't use in our everyday talk. I never do. I mean, do you ever, think back over the last week. How many times did you use the word propitiation in a conversation? Never. So it's a word we don't use, but we need to define. A propitiation means a sacrifice that is satisfactory to satisfy the demands of justice. John says he's the sacrifice that satisfies the demands of justice for the whole world. That's what Paul is here meaning when he says, having made peace through the blood of his cross. That means when Jesus said it is finished, it is accomplished, it is done, what got done is there's now a state of peace, or no discord, no dissonance between heaven and earth. Well, a person might argue, yeah, but what about all the people who are running around, doing something bad, doing wrong things? Well, what do you think Jesus was doing on that cross? He wasn't just dying for sins that had been committed up to that point and then we start over again. He was looking into the future and into the past and gathering all of the penalty into himself. So now there exists a state of peace between heaven and earth. Let's just go on reading. And Paul's going to make that explicit. It says, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him, that means Jesus. That's who he was talking about prior to this verse. That's how I know. By him, Jesus, to reconcile all things to himself. By him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. Now, what does it mean to reconcile? That means to bring back into harmony again those things that might have been out of harmony. To bring into alignment. When I first got a checking account, when I was a teenager, my parents took me to the bank and they gave me a little bit of money. We opened a checking account. And so First month, I got this thing from the bank, this statement from the bank, and it listed all of my transactions on there. And my mom sat down with me and said, now this is what you're supposed to do. When you get that thing in the mail, you have your checkbook over here, and you've got your record of things, but you've got their statement over here. And so you mark them off and you compare them, and she said, this is how you reconcile your checkbook. That means you bring it into harmony. You bring it into alignment, because guess what? I might have forgot to write one down. Or I might have made a mistake. I might have made a math mistake. That's pretty common, with me. I mean, I might have wrote down 50 cents when it was really 75 cents. That's a small mistake, but that's a mistake nevertheless. And so you look at what they said and look at what you said, and so you make them all match. And generally what that means is you change yours to match theirs, because chances are they're right and you're wrong, generally speaking. That's how you reckon. That means you bring it into harmony. Now that's just a trivial example, but we're talking about something really important here. We're talking about humanity. He says he's reconciled, he's brought into alignment, he's made a match. There's no out of alignment. That's what his death accomplished. When he said it is finished, that's what he finished. And that only makes sense if you consider that Jesus is dealing with the penalty. The wages of sin is death, and his death was satisfactory. So the wage is collected or paid. The debt is paid. Just like the Passover lamb, the death was enough. Anyway, he says, having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. Now this is a pretty big description here. He's drawing a big circle around the whole universe, things in earth and things in heaven. But you're a part of that too, you see. And then he says in the next verse, verse 21, he makes it a little more. He wants to bring it down to, as we say, down to brass tacks, down to where you live, and in you specifically. Verse 21, when he says "and you," he means you, the reader. So we're not the first readers. We're reading over their shoulders, but it applies to us as well. And you that were sometime alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath he reconciled. This is such an important thought that he's conveying here. Sometimes people feel like they are alienated from God or separated because of their mistakes or because of their wrongdoing. Now, many of you know, but some of you may not know, that on Sunday nights I go out to the prison here in town, Bill Johnson Correctional Center, and have a Sunday night church service. And we do the exact same thing there that we do here. Sing the exact same songs and talk about the exact same things. And sometimes when I've had this happen more than once, I guess. It's not every time, but maybe, 5 to 10 times this has happened. I've been doing it for a long time. So you go in through the entrance there, they call that the control, and then they shut this big metal door, and then you have to walk across this big concrete slab over to where the church, or the chapel, the church service. And then I have to walk back, see, after I'm done. And so sometimes, and this has happened several times, a guy will come and kind of sidle up to me, kind of, walk beside me and talk while I'm going to the gate or to the exit. And generally this is how the conversation goes. He'll say something like this. He'd say, "I didn't come to church tonight," and I'll always butt in and say, "You don't have to come. Nobody make it. You come if you want to." But he said, "I didn't come to church tonight because here's why. Because he'll say, I used to be a Christian, but I'm backslid." Now, by the way, that's terminology that you hear in church, but you don't read in the Bible. That's church talk, but it's not Bible talk. That's a church idea. That's an idea that is given to people wrongly, mistakenly in church, but you don't read that word in the Bible. And it is actually a false conception. What he means by that is, and this is what people mean when they say, "I backslid," that's something you hear in church. And if you've never heard that before, well, just, thank your lucky stars that you never had to hear that word. What it implies is something that's not true. It implies that, well, I came to church and I considered myself a Christian, but then I started doing things that were wrong and did things I felt bad about, and then I felt bad and didn't want to go back to church because that made me feel bad, and so I quit coming to church. Now I'm backslid. Well, you don't ever find that in the Bible. You don't find that terminology. Paul here says, listen to what he says again, you who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind by or because of wicked works, yet now hath he reconciled. Whenever one of those young men will say to me, I used to go to church, I used to be a Christian, but I'm backslid, I interrupt him at that point and say, you know what? Everywhere you think you slid, God slid with you. And that always shocks them, No, surely not. See, Paul is here saying that if you think in your mind, he says, alienated and enemies, he says in your mind. In other words, if you think you're separate or alienated or enemies of God, it's all in your mind. Because what's in God's mind is, I've already done something to remedy that situation. And that's what the topic is here. You see, instead of thinking about, it says here, because of wicked works, what you need to do is apply some additional facts to that. Why was Jesus on the cross? See, we're talking about what was accomplished, what was done. What was he doing up there on that cross? Well, he said, when he said it is finished, he told them at the Last Supper, he said, this is my blood shed for many for the discharge from penalties, from sins. You see, the only thing that alienates or makes us enemies of God is those sins or those mistakes or those things that would disqualify us. Paul is here saying that his death has remedied that situation, and that if you consider yourself an alienated person from God or an enemy or somehow out of sync with him, it's in your mind. So what needs to change is your mind. You need to think it through a little differently. See, because he says, yet now hath he reconciled. He says, you may feel alienated or enemies in your mind because of mistakes or faults or flaws or disqualifying actions. But here's what he said, yet now. That means, instead of that, yet now, think of it this way, yet now hath he reconciled. In other words, quit thinking about you and what you did. Think about what he did to fix what you did. That's my paraphrase. And that's free, by the way, no charge for that. That's my little paraphrase. Yet in other words, you thought you messed it up, but he fixed it. So when he says, yet now hath he reconciled, he's saying, sure, yeah, right. We've all done, we've all made mistakes. But if you're alienated or enemies, you're not. It's in your mind. In his mind is you're reconciled. But he's still not done yet. That's pretty good. I think that's pretty good news. But there's more, just like those TV commercials. But wait, there's more. You know how they do that. This is a good commercial here. But wait, there's more. Verse 22. This is the best one of all, I think. Paul is talking about here what got accomplished, what got done by the death of Jesus on the cross. What was finished, what was completed. Now, he's still talking about it in verse 22 when he says, in the body of his flesh through death. Now that tells us that we're talking about Jesus and his death on the cross. Isn't that where his death took place? In the body of his flesh through death, meaning his death. And by the way, let me just emphasize the fact that this is something that he did himself and you're not expected to do. It's not your flesh through you paying for something. It's his flesh through his death. And the result is, after the comma, the result is, I'm reading King James translation, to present you holy, unblameable, and unreprovable in his sight. What does that mean? That means the result of his death on the cross is he presents you holy, unblameable, and unreprovable in the sight of God. Meaning that his death was so satisfactory in dealing with all the things that are wrong, having erased all those things. If you had a shirt or a pair of pants or something that got stained and got some kind of, spilled something on it and it's got a really bad stain on it. But if you had the right kind of detergent, the right kind of things, and put it in the wash and it comes out on the other side, sure, it was stained, but now the stains are removed. The thing that would have disqualified that garment from being worn again has been taken away. So now it's just as good as new. We use that expression sometimes. Well, that's what he means by this. The death of Jesus on the cross has made you good as new. See, did you notice, by the way, and if you didn't, I might call it to your attention. Did you notice here in this passage that I'm commenting on, he hasn't told you to do anything yet? Did anybody notice that besides me? I tend to notice that because this makes me kind of a pariah among preachers. I get called on the car. People get mad at me for not saying that this is the result of you doing something. What I've read so far is all that Paul has talked about is the death of Jesus accomplishing something. In the body of his flesh through death, he said the result is to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable. If you stop most Christians on the street and say, what's going to make me holy? What makes me holy? Well, you're going to get a lot of different answers. Mostly, it depends who you talk to, I suppose. Mostly it boils down to some kind of thing you do. Don't play cards, or women cut your hair a certain way, or these little trivial things like that. I was listening to one man who said that he was raised in a really strict denomination where they thought it was unholy and for men to wear shorts. And so all the time he was going to school, he couldn't participate in gym class because they made him wear shorts. And at the time when this man who I'm quoting from was talking about this, he was pretty tall man. He was also a pretty big man. He said, I really paid a price for that, not being in gym class, because he was a pretty big man, But see, things like wearing shorts or playing cards or going to a dance and stuff like that some churches make a big deal about, those are trivial and insignificant and utterly unimportant things. Nevertheless, even if they were important things, as Paul didn't say here anything about haircut or a dance or playing cards about in context of being holy. He said what Jesus did on the cross in eliminating or discharging you from the penalty from your sins, he said that's what makes you holy. Let me read you this translation, this from another translation. This is verse 22. The expanded Bible, instead of saying unblameable and unreprovable, here's what it says. You ready? Having no wrong, without blemish, and having nothing of which God can judge you guilty. Blameless, innocent, free of accusation. Now keep in mind, all of that is the result of the death of Jesus on the cross, because he said in the body of his flesh through death. The result is, and I'm going to quote it again, you have no wrong, without blemish, having nothing of which God can judge you guilty, blameless, innocent, free of accusation. That man I was just talking about, by the way, that I quoted, who said that when he was growing up, his parents wouldn't let him wear shorts, and he couldn't participate in gym class, commenting on a verse like this one time, saying, there's no wrong, you have no blemish, nothing of which God can judge you guilty, blameless, innocent, free of accusation. He said that he read a verse like that one time and he just blurted out loud, I don't know if I believe that or not. And then immediately he said, I felt another thought came to my mind, presumably from the Holy Spirit, saying, that's right, that's why you keep acting the way you do, because you don't believe it. By the way, and I'm going to point it out again, he didn't tell you here to do anything to cause this. He doesn't tell you that this is the result of anything that you do. So what do you do with a verse like this that doesn't tell you to do anything? There's really only one thing you can do when confronted with a verse like we're reading here. That is just embrace it and say, I believe it's true. See, that's what our job is, by the way. Wholly and completely is to believe, to embrace, to trust in this that he has done. Here it is from another translation. This is the Easy English version. I've really come to like this version. I find a lot of good things translated from the Easy English version. This is verse 22 in the Easy English version. He's talking about what was done, what was accomplished, what got finished by the death of Jesus on the cross. Easy English version says, but now you have become God's friend. I like that. That has a nice ring to it. Doesn't it have a nice ring? I like the sound of that. But now you have become God's friend. This happened because Christ died on the cross. As a result, God has brought you to himself. As you stand in front of him, you're completely good and clean inside. He sees nothing in you that is bad. Well, I don't know about you, but I like that. I like the sound of that. And not just, that I like the sound of that. That is precisely what is being conveyed by the Apostle Paul in this verse 22. So, if you want to ask the question, what did Jesus mean on the cross when he said, it is finished, or as other translations we read say, it is accomplished, or it's finished, or it got done, got completed. What got done? What got completed? What got done is the sin got paid for. And as a result, you got clean. And you know what? We're just supposed to embrace it and believe it. And I'll tell you something else. It's amazing what happens when you start believing what he says is true about you. I'll end by telling you this little story. And April is back there. She'll be my witness that this is true. That there used to, do they still have the garden club? Or is it disbanded? Lily knows too. Is it gone now? Well, which one was it that had the yard of the month? Was it Tulip or? Oh, they all went together. Okay, so there were 2 or 3 different garden clubs, and they all got together. And trying to think of these ladies. These ladies would drive around town, see, and they'd look at the yards. And they had this metal sign. It was one of those realtor signs, like a for sale sign, but they painted over it. And they painted over it, and it said yard of the month. And so they'd drive around and find some yard they thought was really spiffy, and they would jump out of the car. Well, I shouldn't jump out there. They would get out of the car, and they weren't doing a lot of jumping. But they would, and when I came, when April joined, then me and my pickup took the place of that. But anyway, somebody got out of the car and put that sign in the yard. And so when those people came home, whoa, yard of the month, and they were, because that happened to us one time. See, this is how we got involved in it. One day we came back from Walmart, and we were at the store, and out of the blue, just without any warning or expectation, or nobody gave us any heads up about it, we came driving down the street and said, what's that? And, well, look at that sign in the yard. It says yard of the month. And I'll just tell you, this is the real truth about it. Suddenly, when this sign was labeling us yard of the month, it changed my whole attitude and behavior in relation to that yard. Because, I'll just be honest with you, I don't like mowing the yard, and I just get out there and do it, just get it done, and don't really pay any attention to how well it's done. I mean, I just want to get it done, get it over with, so I might just, come along the curb there, and it's, where the wheels on the curb, it cuts it a little too much, and it's bare dirt sticking out, and, maybe not get the corners, or, who cares? That's kind of my attitude about it. But all of a sudden, when they put that sign in the yard that says, you are yard of the month, I'm all of a sudden like, man, I'm down there adjusting the wheel and measuring it with a tape measure and getting it just exactly perfect. And you kids get those hoses and roll them up and get them out of here. We're yard of the month, and get that ladder and hide it, and it changed my whole attitude about the yard, because I saw, I saw myself, in a sense, identity-wise, as yard of the month. So in relation to the yard, it changed everything. And so what I'm saying is that's a kind of a trivial, humorous, analogy. But you see, if you can, in your mind, see yourself the way God sees you as a result of what Jesus has done in his finished work on the cross, and we call it finished work because he said it is finished, holy and unblameable, and let me see, what did these other ones said? Having no wrong, without blemish, nothing of which God can judge you guilty, blameless, innocent, free of accusation. If you see yourself that way, it changes your whole attitude about yourself and the way you move in the course of your life and the way you interact with other people, really everything. And so the Christian life is a life of believing what he has already done. It's not trying to make something be true. It's just embracing and believing what already is true. Okay, that's all we got today on this week before Easter. And next week we get to talk about why the resurrection and what did that do for us. Okay, thank you, Tori.